I spent 3 weeks in Koh Samui thinking I discovered paradise, and honestly, I wasn't ready to leave. The beaches were everything Instagram promised. The food was incredible, and I finally found that perfect beachside bungalow where I could hear waves crashing while sipping my morning coffee. But then something happened that I absolutely did not see coming. Something that made me question everything I thought I knew about Southeast Asian travel. Before I tell you what changed everything, you need to understand where my head was at. I've been planning this Koh Samui trip for 8 months. I'm talking spreadsheets, save locations, a whole folder of screenshots from travel blogs. I was convinced this was going to be the trip of a lifetime. And for those first 3 weeks, it absolutely was. I found hidden waterfalls that weren't crowded with tourists. I befriended local restaurant owners who showed me their family recipes. And I even learned to ride a scooter without crashing into anything, which for me is a legitimate achievement. My daily routine became something I never wanted to end. Wake up around 7, grab fresh mango from the market lady, who always gave me extra because I apparently reminded her of her nephew, then spend the morning working from a different beach cafe each day. The afternoons were for exploration, finding those secret spots that don't make it onto the tour group itineraries. Evenings meant watching the sunset from somewhere new, usually with a coconut in hand and sand between my toes. I was living what felt like the dream, and I kept thinking, how does anyone ever leave this place and go back to normal life? But travel has this weird way of testing you when you least expect it. I met someone at a reggae bar on my 19th night in Samui, a photographer from Australia who'd been bouncing around Southeast Asia for 6 months. We got talking about our routes, our favorite discoveries, the usual traveler conversation. Then he said something that stuck with me. He said Koh Samui was beautiful, sure, but it was like watching a really good movie that you've seen before. You know what's coming, you know the beats, you know exactly how you're supposed to feel. Then he leaned back and said, if you really want to feel something unexpected, something that actually surprises you, you need to cross over to Malaysia. Now, I'm not usually the type to change plans based on random bar conversations. I had my itinerary, I had my perfect routine, and I still had for more days booked in my bungalow. But that comment bothered me in a way I couldn't shake. Had I become so comfortable in paradise that I'd stopped actually experiencing anything new? Was I just checking boxes on my mental list of tropical experiences? That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about what it meant to be truly surprised by a place, to feel that rush of discovering something you had no idea existed. The next morning, I did something impulsive. I canceled my remaining nights in Samui, which hurt because I love that bungalow, and I booked a flight to Penang. I didn't do research. I didn't make a plan. I just knew I needed to test this theory. If this Australian photographer was wrong, fine. I'd proven my point, and Koh Samui will remain my gold standard. But if he was right, if Malaysia somehow managed to top what I've been experiencing, then everything I thought I knew about this region was about to get flipped upside down. The flight from Samui to Penang is short, barely over an hour, but it felt like traveling between different dimensions. I landed in the early evening, and immediately the air felt different. Not worse, not better, just different. There was a humidity to it that somehow felt more alive, like the atmosphere itself was buzzing with energy. I grabbed my backpack from the carousel and stepped outside into chaos that was somehow organized, noise that was somehow musical. The taxi driver who picked me up spoke 3 languages in the span of 5 minutes, switching between Malay, Chinese, and English like it was the most natural thing in the world. During the drive to my hostel, he gave me a geography lesson, a history lesson, and a restaurant recommendation that he guaranteed would change my life. I thought he was exaggerating with that last part. He was not exaggerating, but I'm getting ahead of myself. That first night in Georgetown, which is the main city in Penang, I didn't do anything ambitious. I was tired from the sudden change, from leaving behind my comfortable routine, and honestly, I was second-guessing my impulsive decision. I walked around the neighborhood near my hostel, which was full of these incredible old buildings with peeling paint that somehow looked artistic rather than run down. Street art covered the walls, but not the typical graffiti you see everywhere. These were massive murals telling stories, little metal sculptures depicting everyday life, Interactive pieces that made you stop and really look at what you were seeing. I grabbed dinner from a hawker stall because I was too tired to find a proper restaurant. And this is where things started to shift. The woman running the stall asked me what I wanted, and when I hesitated because I didn't recognize anything on her menu board, she just smiled and said, "Trust me." 10 minutes later, she handed me a plate of char kway teow, which I'd never heard of before. It's flat rice noodles stir-fried with shrimp, Chinese sausage, bean sprouts, and this dark soy sauce that gives an almost smoky flavor. I took one bite, and I had to stop walking. I just stood there on the street corner, like an idiot, because I couldn't believe food could taste like this. Here's the thing that started to dawn on me. In Koh Samui, the food was good, sometimes really good, but it was familiar good. It was what I expected Thai food to taste like based on every Thai restaurant I'd ever been to back home. This dish I was holding, this random plate from a random stall that I'd ordered because I was too tired to care, this was something else entirely. This was flavors I didn't have a reference point for, combinations that shouldn't work, but absolutely did. And this was just street food. This was what people grabbed on a Tuesday night, when they couldn't be bothered to cook. The next morning, I woke up a mission. I needed to understand what made this place different. I started walking with no real destination, just following my instincts through the streets of Georgetown. The architecture alone was blowing my mind. You'd have a Chinese clan house next to a British colonial building, next to an Indian temple, next to a modern coffee shop. And somehow it all felt cohesive. This wasn't a city trying to be one thing. This was a city that had absorbed centuries of different influences, and instead of picking one identity, it just said, we're all of it. I ducked into a coffee shop that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1940s, ordered a cup of traditional Hainanese coffee, and struck up a conversation with the elderly man sitting next to me. His name was Mr. Tan. He was 83 years old, and for the next hour, he told me stories about Penang that I couldn't have found in any guidebook. He explained how Georgetown became this cultural melting pot, how traders from China, India, Arabia, and Europe all converged here because of its strategic port location. He talked about how different communities didn't just coexist, but actually blended, creating something entirely new. His grandmother was Chinese, his grandfather was Indian, and he grew up speaking 4 languages because that's just what you did if you want to talk to everyone in your neighborhood. What really got me was when he said, Penang is not about being one thing perfectly. It's about being many things beautifully. That sentence rattled around in my head for the rest of the day. In Koh Samui, everything was about being perfectly Thai, perfectly tropical, perfectly what a beach paradise should be, and it achieved that goal brilliantly. But Malaysia, or at least this corner of it, wasn't trying to be perfect at one thing. It was trying to be genuinely itself, which meant embracing complexity and contradiction and mess. I spent the next week in Penang, just absorbing everything I could. I ate my way through hawker centers where a single meal cost less than a cocktail in Samui, but tasted better than most fancy restaurants I'd been anywhere. I'm talking about dishes like laksa, which is a spicy sour noodle soup that hits every taste receptor simultaneously, or nasi kandar, where you point at various curries and sides, and they pile it onto rice in combinations that seem random but taste like they were scientifically designed for maximum flavor. Every meal felt like a revelation, and I started to realize that food here wasn't just about eating. It was about history, about migration, about communities sharing their cultures through recipes passed down across generations. The more time I spent in Penang, the more I started noticing things that would have been impossible in Koh Samui, not because Samui was lacking, but because they were fundamentally different places with different goals. In Samui, tourism was a main event. Everything catered to visitors, which again, isn't a criticism. That's what makes it great at what it does. But in Penang, tourism felt like a side effect. The city existed first and foremost for people who lived there, and travelers like me were just lucky enough to experience it alongside them. I watched a Chinese opera performance in a community center, where I was the only foreigner in the audience. I stumbled into a Tamil festival where families welcomed me to join their celebration, even though I had no idea what was happening. I found a used bookstore run by a Malay guy who only stocked books about Southeast Asian history, and spent 2 hours giving me his perspective on colonial legacy. These weren't curated tourist experiences. These were just Thursday afternoon in Penang. But then I started wondering if this was just a Penang thing, if I had just gotten lucky with one special city. So I decided to test it further. I took a bus down to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia's capital, expecting something completely different. Big cities usually lose that local authenticity, right? They become all skyscrapers and chain restaurants and experiences designed for Instagram rather than actual living. I figured KL would be when Malaysia magic wore off and reality set in. I could not have been more wrong, but not in the way I expected. Kuala Lumpur hit me like sensory overload in the best possible way. This city is chaos and sophistication existing in the same breath. You got the Petronas Twin Towers, which are genuinely stunning and make you feel tiny in that good way architecture sometimes can, standing next to neighborhoods where street food vendors have been operating from the same spot for 40 years. I found myself in Chinatown at midnight eating the best wontons of my life from a stall that had a line of locals waiting patiently, nobody speaking English, everybody knowing exactly what they wanted because they'd been coming here since childhood. Here's what really got me about KL. Though, the city had this energy that I'd never encountered before. In Koh Samui, the energy was relaxed, chill, exactly what you want from a beach destination. But KL had this vibrating intensity. Like everyone had somewhere to be and something important to do, but they still had time to help you figure out the train system or recommend their favorite restaurant. I got lost trying to find the Bata Caves, which are these incredible limestone caves with Hindu temples inside, and a woman who spoke minimal English literally walked me 15 minutes out of her way to make sure I found a right train platform. The Bata Caves themselves were another one of those moments where I had to stop and recalibrate. You climb 272 rainbow steps, which sounds exhausting, but the view makes every step worth it. And at the top, you're surrounded by monkeys who have zero fear of humans and temples built inside massive cave formations that make you feel like you've entered another world. This wasn't ancient history preserved behind glass. This was living religion, active worship, daily life happening in a space that felt both sacred and completely accessible. I spent a week in KL just wandering, and every day revealed new layers. I discovered Kampung Baru, this traditional Malay village somehow preserved right in the middle of the modern city, where you can eat authentic Malay food in wooden houses while skyscrapers loom in the background. I explored the Islamic Arts Museum, which even as someone with zero knowledge of Islamic art, I found absolutely mesmerizing. The craftsmanship, the geometry, the way every piece told a story about trade routes and cultural exchange. I started understanding that Malaysia wasn't just a place. It was a living example of what happens when different cultures decide to share space rather than fight over it. But I still had this nagging question. Was this just a city thing? Were Penang and KL special cases? And if I went somewhere more rural, more remote, will I find that same quality that had completely changed my perspective? So I made another impulsive decision. I booked a bus to the Highlands, which is this mountainous region where the British established tea plantations during colonial times. I figured this would be a totally different vibe, probably more touristy, probably more like what I'd experienced in Thailand's northern regions. The bus ride itself was an adventure. 6 hours of winding mountain roads with a driver who seemed to know every curve by heart, and a bus full of locals who were amused by the confused foreigner trying to figure out which stop was his. A grandmother sitting next to me shared her homemade key, these sweet Malay snacks, and tried to teach me bites of Malaysia phrases that I immediately forgot but appreciated learning. When we finally arrived in Tanah Rata, the main town in the Highlands, I stepped off the bus into air that was actually cold. Not cool, actually cold. I'd gotten so used to tropical heat that I'd forgotten temperatures below 75 degrees existed. The Highlands broke my brain in a completely different way. Here was this landscape that looked like it should be in England, rolling green hills covered in tea plantations, cool misty mornings, strawberry farms, but surrounded by jungle and maintained by communities who created their own unique culture over generations. I spent 3 days hiking through mossy forests that felt prehistoric, visiting tea factories where workers explained the entire process from leaf to cup with obvious pride in their craft, and eating steamboat, which is like hot pot, but with a distinctly Malaysian twist, in restaurants where the heating came from actual charcoal. What struck me most was how different this was from anything I'd experienced in Koh Samui, but also how it was distinctly Malaysian in ways I was starting to recognize. That same mixing of influences, that same refusal to be just one thing, that same sense that tourism was secondary to the actual life happening here. The people working the tea plantations weren't performing Malaysian culture for visitors. They were just living their lives, and we were lucky enough to witness it. One afternoon, I hired a guide to take me to some of the less visited hiking trails. His name was Raj. He was Tamil Malaysian, and he'd grown up in these highlands. As we walked through the forest, he told me about how his grandfather came here from India to work on the tea plantations, how his father had stayed and built a life here, how he decided to become a guide because he wanted people to understand that the Cameron Highlands wasn't just pretty scenery. It was home to communities who'd shaped this landscape and been shaped by it in return. He pointed out plants I never would have noticed, explained the ecosystem, talked about conservation efforts led by local groups trying to protect the forest from overdevelopment. At one point, we reached a viewpoint overlooking the tea plantations, and Raj just stopped talking for a minute. Then he said something I'll never forget. He said, "People come here thinking Malaysia is going to be like Thailand or Indonesia, just another stop on the Southeast Asia circuit. But Malaysia is different because we never decided what we were supposed to be. We just kept adding, kept mixing, kept becoming more ourselves. That's why travelers either love it here or don't understand it at all." That comment hit me hard because it explained everything I'd been feeling. Koh Samui, as beautiful and perfect as it was, had a clear identity. It knew what it was supposed to be and executed that vision flawlessly. Malaysia, on the other hand, seemed to actively resist having a single identity. It was Chinese and Indian and Malay and British and indigenous and modern and traditional and religious and secular all at once. And instead of that being confusing, it somehow made perfect sense. I left the Cameron Highlands and headed to my final Malaysian destination, Melaka, which is this historic port city on the west coast. I'd read that Melaka was where you could see the full span of Malaysian history in one compact area. And that description turned out to be accurate in ways I wasn't prepared for. Walking through Melaka felt like moving through time. You'd see Portuguese ruins from the 1500s, then turn a corner and find yourself in a Chinese temple from the 1700s, then walk past a Dutch town square, then end up in a Malay kampung that felt entirely contemporary. But what really solidified everything for me was an experience I had on my last night in Melaka. I was eating dinner at a Peranakan restaurant, which is this cuisine that developed from Chinese immigrants marrying into Malay families and creating something entirely new. The food was incredible, this complex blend of Chinese ingredients with Malay spices and cooking techniques. But what got me was overhearing a conversation at the next table. It was a family, 3 generations eating together, and they kept switching languages mid-sentence. The grandmother spoke mostly Malay with some Hokkien Chinese mixed in. The parents alternated between Malay and English, and the kids responded in English but understood everything in all 3 languages. Nobody thought this was weird. This was just how communication worked. Sitting there, eating food that existed because cultures merged, listening to a family effortlessly navigate multiple languages, watching the street outside where a Chinese shop house stood next to a mosque, I finally understood what Malaysia had that Koh Samui couldn't have. Not because Samui was inferior, but because they were fundamentally different experiences. Koh Samui offered perfection within a specific vision of paradise. Malaysia offered complexity, contradiction, and a kind of authenticity that comes from not trying to be anything other than exactly what it is. The food alone tells a story better than I ever could. In Thailand, you get incredible Thai food, and I'm not diminishing that at all. But in Malaysia, you get Malay food and Chinese food and Indian food, and then you get all these hybrid cuisines that emerge from communities living together for centuries. You get mamak stalls where Indian Muslims serve Malaysian-style Indian food that doesn't exist in India. You get nasi lemak, which is Malay, served alongside dim sum, which is Chinese, and nobody questions it because this is normal. You get roti canai, which came from Indian immigrants but evolved into something distinctly Malaysian. Every meal tells a story about migration, adaptation, and cultural exchange. The architecture, does the same thing. The language does the same thing. The music, the festivals, the daily rhythms of life. Everything in Malaysia reflects this incredible mixing that happened not because someone planned it, but because people from different backgrounds decided to share space and, over time, created something new while maintaining their distinct identities. That's not easy to achieve. Most places either become homogenized or balkanized. Malaysia somehow managed to be diverse and unified simultaneously. Now, I need to be clear about something. I'm not saying Malaysia is better than Thailand or that you should skip Koh Samui for Penang. That's not the point at all. Koh Samui is exceptional at being what it is, a tropical paradise where you can disconnect from the world and recharge in beautiful surroundings. I love my time there, and I'd go back in a heartbeat. But what happened when I crossed over to Malaysia was that I experienced something I wasn't expecting, something I didn't know I needed. Travel often becomes predictable. You see the same types of destinations marketed in the same ways, promising the same experiences. Beach paradise looks like this. Cultural city looks like that. Mountain retreat follows this pattern. And there's nothing wrong with that predictability. Sometimes you want exactly what you expect. But Malaysia shattered my expectations not by being radically different from Southeast Asia, but by being more itself than I thought any place could be. It wasn't trying to fit into a category or meet tourist expectations. It was just Malaysia, take it or leave it. What I realized over those weeks exploring different regions was that Malaysia's greatest strength is also what makes it harder to market to travelers. It doesn't have a simple story. You can't summarize it in a catchy phrase or a carefully curated Instagram aesthetic. Penang isn't just beaches or just culture or just food. It's all of it simultaneously. Kuala Lumpur isn't just modern or just traditional. It's actively both. The Cameron Highlands aren't just scenic or just about tea. They're about communities building lives in challenging terrain while maintaining connections to multiple cultural traditions. This complexity means Malaysia often gets overshadowed by its neighbors. Thailand has beaches and temples. Indonesia has Bali. Singapore has efficiency and modernity. Vietnam has food and history. And Malaysia has all of these things too, but it doesn't specialize in any one of them in a way that makes for easy travel branding. It's genuinely all of the above, which makes it harder to explain but infinitely more rewarding to experience. I spent a total of 5 weeks in Malaysia, and I left feeling like I'd barely scratched the surface. I never made it to Borneo to see the orangutans and the rainforests. I skipped the islands on the east coast that locals told me rivaled anything in Thailand. I didn't explore the interior regions where indigenous communities maintain traditions going back millennia. I missed so many places that each deserve their own visit, their own deep dive. And that's the thing about Malaysia. It's not a destination you can check off a list. It's a place that reveals itself slowly, in layers, rewarding curiosity and patience. So when I think back to that conversation in the Koh Samui reggae bar, when that Australian photographer told me Malaysia would surprise me, I understand now what he meant. He wasn't saying Malaysia had better beaches or better food or better anything specific. He was saying Malaysia would make me feel something different, make me see travel differently, remind me why I started exploring in the first place. And he was absolutely right. If you're planning a Southeast Asia trip and you're debating whether to include Malaysia, my answer is yes, but with a caveat. Don't go to Malaysia expecting it to compete with Thailand's beaches or Indonesia's temples or Vietnam's history. Go to Malaysia expecting to be confused and delighted and surprised. Go expecting to eat things you've never heard of. Go expecting to see cultural mixing that shouldn't work, but does. Go expecting to have your assumptions challenged about what a place can be. Because that's what Malaysia does better than anywhere else I've traveled. It exists on its own terms, unapologetically complex, refusing to simplify itself for anyone, and somehow making you grateful for that complexity rather than frustrated by it. That's what happened when I expected Koh Samui to impress me, and then Malaysia happened. Not a competition, not a comparison, just a completely different experience that changed how I think about travel, about culture, about what it means for a place to be authentically itself.